Today's briefing is on the decision by the High Court to back the ban on prayer rituals at the Michaela School in North London. Some schools do have prayer rooms, but Michaela's head teacher, Catherine Birbal-Singh, has taken an opposite view, saying this will ensure inclusivity and social cohesion in the school. The decision has provoked a wide discussion on the place of religion in schools and what it means to live in a multicultural society. And joining us to discuss this, we have Dr. Azim Ahmed, Deputy Director of the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK, based in Cardiff, and the Secretary-General of the Muslim Council of Wales, Professor Russell Sandberg, Professor of Law at Cardiff University and author of many books on law and religion, Ed Paulson, Education Consultant, RE Advisor and Deputy Chair of the Religious Education Council, and Dr. Joseph Downing, International Relations and Politics at Aston University and Fellow of the LSE on Minority Rights, Migration and Islam in France. So I'm going to start with you, Professor Sandberg, if I may. On the judgment itself, one of the ways that it lost was that the judgment found it wasn't in breach of the pupil's human rights. Wasn't in breach of the right to freedom to manifest her religious beliefs. Can you tell me whether that came as a surprise to you?
It was quite surprising. I mean, I've long learned not to try and to predict what happens in terms of these cases, because with litigation, with cases, there's obviously two ways it can always go, and there's always an arguable case on each side. But I think what's really important about this case is that it's one of the cases, one of many cases, where perceptions of the case and what it holds are probably as important as what it holds legally. And, you know, my concern is how this case is going to be summarized, how it's going to be popularly understood, as well as how it's going to be understood as a matter of law. As a matter of law, to get back to the actual question posed, it is a rather surprising judgment in that one of the parts of the claim was that the prayer ban, the ritual prayer ban, breached the claimants, the schoolgirls, Article 9 rights. Article 9 is the Convention, the European Convention on Human Rights article, which provides for freedom of thought, conscience and religion and the right to manifest religion or belief. And Article 9, like a lot of convention rights, operates under two tests. The first test is the right interfered with? Is it in play? And then the second part is, if it is in play, has the limitation by the state, is that limitation by the state justified? Now, in this case, the High Court held that there was no interference with the claimant's Article 9 rights, but if it had been interference, it would have been justified. Now, I think there's a lot to say about both of those limbs, but I'm particularly concerned about the first one. Because the first one, where they say there was no interference whatsoever here with the claimant's Article 9 rights, seems nonsensical as a matter of logic. Her right to manifest her belief, her right to prayer, was interfered with. It was limited in this case. But the High Court held that it was not and relied on the idea of voluntary acceptance. So relied on the idea that by going to this school, the schoolgirl had accepted the school rules and so were bound by them.
Didn't the judgment also say that the Article 9 doesn't give an absolute right to manifest religious beliefs? So I'm wondering whether that clause could be used again in any case, if that could always be said in answer that there's no absolute right to manifest freedom of religion.
Well, in relation to that, I think the court is spot on, because actually it isn't absolute, because it can always be limited. The question is whether the limitation can be justified. And so the reference to absolute simply means that it's a right which can be limited in certain circumstances. What's more problematic here, I think, is the fact that the voluntary acceptance argument was used to say that the right was not interfered with at all. So you don't even get then to the question of justification. So the logic here of the court, they say this, the judgment says this, is that basically she could go to another school. If she doesn't like it in this school, she chose this school, she can go to another school. Now, that to me, doesn't fit right in an education context where she didn't decide the school. Her parents and guardians may have decided the school some time ago. Her religious beliefs may well have changed since being part of that school. But even if you say even if you disregard the education element of this means that no challenge can be brought in Article 9 grounds in the employment context, in the education context, in any situation where you can say, oh, they voluntarily accepted those rules, they could go elsewhere to manifest their religious belief. That, to me, makes Article 9 virtually redundant. Now, it's worth also mentioning this case was also argued on equality grounds under the Equality Act. So there are other rights in play if Article 9 doesn't function. And it's notable that in relation to the equality argument, it was accepted that there was a detriment, but that detriment was justified. So legally, I think this case is very problematic in terms of what it says about Article 9.
One of the conclusions drawn afterwards was that this judgment gives individual schools the right to take decisions appropriate to their own circumstances. How do you reflect on that conclusion, that there's basically going to be a free-for-all on whether schools allow religious observances?
Well, I think that's less damaging, although there is a need for regulation here. There's a need for guidance here. There is a need for support. But I think what this case is more likely to be understood as is that other schools can do what Michaela School did. And that's a deeply problematic conclusion because all this case establishes, it's a High Court case, so it's quite low down in terms of senior court decisions. It's a High Court case which simply establishes that what the school did, what Michaela School did, in the circumstances in which they did it, was not unlawful. It does not mean that this is good practice. It does not mean that if the school had done the opposite, it would have been unlawful. So in that respect, the fact that it's, if people conclude from this case that schools can have free rein to do stuff as long as it's justified, then that's relatively fine. But I think this case is going to lead to a lot of confusion. And this case is going to lead to a lot of people understandably summarizing it as going, yeah, we can do that now. And that's not what this case says. This case really does hinge upon its particular facts, the particular situation, and even there, it has to be said, there are question marks about that judgment in relation to whether it was justified in this case.
Thank you for introducing everything to us, and we'll come back to you later in the discussion. But can I turn now to Dr. Azim Ahmed, the Deputy Director of the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK, based in Cardiff. And Dr. Ahmed, you've already been quoted your reaction to this case, I think in the first 24 hours, that you were really disappointed that the court hasn't defended a very well-established British principle of the freedom of religion. Just expand on that a little bit, perhaps, taking in some of Russell Sandberg's observations just now.
Thank you, Ruth. So I think I would echo the same sentiment. I think Britain does actually have a very long tradition of accommodating what at one point would have been non-conformist practice or divergence from Christian practice. But increasingly, as Britain became more diverse, and this diversity is not necessarily even recent, we're talking about diversity of Britain being a multi-religious empire for a very long time. That those principles are quite well established. And this, I think, is a change in that approach, especially in the schooling context, where the importance of providing pupils, no matter their religious background, a space where they can bring their religious practice, identity, and who they are as human beings into the schooling environment. It's been there for a very long time. So we're starting to see, I think, a shift in that. within certain schools, and that is very concerning. And I think it's disappointing on the grounds that my colleague, Professor Sandberg, just outlined, but also in terms of what it might mean for Muslim pupils in schools across the UK. I think it's worth remembering that the Muslim population as a whole is quite a young population. Michaela School had, I believe from the report, half its pupils from a Muslim background. And so, in that context, it is very concerning. And I mean, we've seen this already. We see a politicization of Muslim identity from politicians, but we're seeing the same thing, especially directed towards Muslims in schools and Muslim pupils. So the Trojan horse affair, I think, is a very representative example of a sort of moral panic and a series of policies resulting from that moral panic, which still have ramifications today. And I think this is a kind of a more recent example of that. And I think the thing that is very concerning, that is very disappointing, is the politicization of Muslim pupils and their religious practice, when really they need to be protected and defended, not just by the schools, but also by the courts and by politicians in the establishment.
Can you just explain to us the rules about prayer rituals and from what age they apply? Does every observant Muslim have to abide by the rules and take time out of work or whatever they're doing in order to pray? What happens if they don't?
I think one of the things which is very distinctive, perhaps I say distinctive, it may not be, about Islam, but which really has to be recognized in this context, is that there is orthodoxy in Islam. There is good practice. There is righteous behavior and sin, and all these concepts that a person might be familiar with. But it's also very personal and individualized. And religious authority isn't enforced in a way which will be recognizable to someone who might be thinking of something akin to a church structure, especially something like the Catholic Church. So what I mean by that is that a single religious authority cannot say, this is Islam, this is how it's practiced, and this is how it should be manifested. And the significance of that is that very often it is about personal choice. So to answer your question, what it might look like, and I can only give a vague description because it will vary from individual to individual about how they prioritize, is that there are 5 daily prayers at different times of the day. Being in the northern latitudes of Britain, those changes will be, the times of day will change according to summer or winter. A person will generally take time out of their day between 5 and 10 minutes to do these prayers. They may need to do ablution, a ritual wash beforehand that can be done in any toilet or anything with a sink. And they'll need a clean place to pray, somewhere quiet and somewhere devoid of any other impurities like you might find elsewhere. So that's the kind of general shape of it. How committed a person is to that, to observing that, is very much a personal decision. And how they committed to the timing of that prayer is very much a personal decision as well. And so I think the principle in this case, and I think this is one of the things about the court case that surprised me, was the implication or the acceptance of a form of orthodoxy or position with Islam through the British legal system. So if a Muslim parent comes and says, well, actually, for my child, Muslim parent comes and says, for my child, they can make their prayers up later at home, and that's okay by my understanding of Islam, that's completely valid for that individual. But likewise, if someone comes and says, well, actually, keeping to the prayer times as they've been kind of outlined within the Islamic tradition and doing so on time is very important to me, and I don't accept that doing things in a delayed fashion is acceptable to being a good Muslim, that also has to be recognized as valid. And I think the concern for me is that there's this kind of backdoor acceptance of a kind of position, a religiously sanctioned position from the British legal system. I'm not familiar if this has been done before, but certainly this is something that strikes me as quite unique about this case.
The head teacher in the case said that part of the reason for banning prayer rituals was the fear of segregation, that Muslim pupils would be segregated, put to one side, regarded as a group, that they would inflame tensions rather than lead to inclusion. What's your comment on that?
It strikes me more as rhetoric than anything grounded in reality. And the reason I say that is because if we're coming to a position where any indication of difference, of individuality, of a belonging to a collective identity which is different from the mainstream, if that is seen as a sign of segregation, is that if that is accepted as somehow being divisive or poor to social cohesion, then it leads us down a very dark path where effectively we're mandating a uniformity of identity, a uniformity of language, a uniformity of practice and self, which isn't, I think, conducive at all to a healthy society. So I see it more as rhetoric than anything grounded in reality. And I certainly think that it is a principle of importance and real value that we need to defend as a society, that individuals can bring their diverse selves into public life without detriment, without discrimination, and be able to fulfill them. And again, I just need to really stress, that there is a young Muslim population in the UK. Statistically, Islam is already Britain's second religion, as it has been for a long time. But this is incredibly important in the schooling context, where the proportion of Muslim pupils is higher than it would be in adult life. So I don't accept that kind of interpretation that difference is inherently segregating or a cause of social disunity or breaking down social cohesion. I think actually that is an argument which is very troubling if it's kind of taken to its logical conclusion.
You've also criticised Kemi Badenoch, who came out shortly after the ruling, saying that this was a victory against activists who were trying to subvert public institutions. And the context of that was that there were reports of bricks being thrown through the window of a home of a teacher, teachers concerned about travelling to school on public transport. There was a fear of aggression, basically, in the campaign. Do you think that she was, or why do you think she was wrong, therefore, to call that out and say that this was a ruling for a victory against activists?
I think, first of all, in terms of the experiences recounted in terms of Michaela School, the aggression, that's an issue for the criminal law courts. That's an issue which we don't have actual access to in terms of knowing the details, context, and extent of that. Not to say it didn't happen, but just to say we can't make a judgment about how that relates to this particular case and the broader principle of religious freedom in schools. But I do think that this kind of cultural war rhetoric around things like activists and similar, I think is a very important part of society, that people can make changes in policy and practice to reflect who they are. That isn't subversive. That isn't, I think, in any way anything less than good citizenship and a sign of belonging and a stake in society. I think institutions do need to change and adapt, reflecting demographics and changing circumstances. And to crystallize a particular practice or crystallize any change or oppose it on the basis that it's somehow subversive, I mean, that itself, I think, is inaccurate. But also, it's taken a case which is fundamentally about a young Muslim's right to pray. And they're disquiet about the way in which their school is treating them and turning it into a national politicized case. It's exactly what we saw in Birmingham with the Children of Horse case, where really the principle should have been protecting those pupils, their educational experience and their rights, and instead it became something else. And I think this was an attempt to do the same, which I think, again, is not befitting of individuals who are in positions of power, whether a head teacher or a politician.
Thank you, Zeman. Again, we can come back to you towards the end. But moving on now to Ed Paulson, another person on our panel who's an education consultant, RE advisor and deputy chair of the Religious Education Council. So picking up some of the points that have been raised so far. Religion in schools. The role of religious education teachers is clear. The operation of assemblies is set out in law, but is there a need for guidance for all schools on issues like this, how religion should be part of the life of a state school, a non-faith state school?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Ruth. Can I just say that I'm speaking in a personal capacity here. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Religious Education Council of England and Wales, but I'm not speaking on behalf of them today. I'm speaking in a personal capacity. Yes, I agree that I think there is a lack of clarity about how religion is understood and treated in schools. I think religion is and religion and worldviews, which is how we would characterize it as religious education teachers. Religion and worldviews are vital parts of our lives and dimensions of who we are as human beings. And I think schools often don't know how to fit religion into their school structures. And I think that's partly because there are so many different if you compare Michaela School, for instance, which has 50% Muslim intake, and you compare that to maybe schools in other areas of the country where there are very few pupils who are practicing worshipping people, that's a remarkably different context. And so I think schools, there is no one-size-fits-all understanding of how religion fits into school life.
What are the groups or organisations within local authorities, perhaps, or national boards who may give advice to schools about their approach to religion? Are there any national guidelines or local guidelines?
Well, there are around religious education, but we're not really talking about religious education here. So SACRE's standing advisory councils on religious education, every local authority has to have a SACRE. Some are more active than others. Some are more geared to giving good advice than others. Local authorities and schools vary enormously on how they draw on advice from their SACREs. Most of our schools, or majority of our schools, probably aren't locally maintained now anyway. They're academized, so they have less connection with their SACREs. So I think there are real questions about who is giving advice to schools on matters of religion across some of the larger multi-academy trusts. There may be an expectation around how religion is understood, and certainly if a school is a school of religious character, in other words, a Church of England school or a Roman Catholic school or a school with other faith designation, then religion has a very clear, much more clarity in the school, because of course those schools are subject to Section 48 inspections, where the belief and values and ethos within the schools are actually inspected. So that's very different from this school that we're talking about, Michaela, which is doesn't have any faith designation.
So do you think that the growth in the number of people affiliated to faiths other than Christianity hasn't fully been appreciated in the system yet, and that state schools now find that they are in need of religious advice where they may not have been receiving it or been even pursued at this in the past?
Well, I think that's interesting. One of the things that came out in this case is that there is sort of a de facto discrimination. Some people have called this a form of Islamophobia, because actually this is a Muslim being discriminated against in this context. And it is a fact that it is probably Muslims more than any other group who will want to pray in schools. I'm not aware of groups of Christians who particularly campaign to pray in schools, and I'm not aware of other groups particularly who, religious or non-religious, who require specific religious designation and opportunity in schools. So there is something rather, and with the growing number of Muslim students in our schools, as I think was said earlier, the Muslim population is a very young population. So this does look like a de facto discrimination against a particular religious group.
Yes, there's a long, convoluted legal argument we were talking about earlier on that point. We can come back to it. But just talking to you about religious education teachers for the moment, what's the fallout in religious education classes when something like this, a dispute like this, maybe you may have a dispute about same-sex beliefs as well. When there's a dispute in a school community, what happens in the religious education classrooms as a result?
Well, the main thing that happens is lots of great discussion, because that's what RE does best. And pupils continue to tell me that, whether primary or secondary, that RE is the place where they are able to share their views. They are able to think for themselves. They are able to explore and develop ideas with philosophical structure and guidance, which allows them to become better critical thinkers. So that would be the big place that I would be exploring this, because I think young people would be very animated about this discussion. Should religious beliefs be recognised within schools to give rights and opportunity to specific groups time to pray or to practice their religious ritual?
What is the goal of religious education in this context of the understanding of multiculturalism and social cohesion in society? We're going to talk to Dr. Joseph Downing in a moment more about this, but within religious education, what's the concept of multiculturalism that drives religious education curriculums?
Well, I think, again, that depends on the type of school, because there are some, if I take Roman Catholic schools, for instance, they're very much arranged around the idea of formation. So religious education is actually the formation of pupils' own personal religious beliefs with a Catholic perspective. Whereas in a school with no religious character, RE would be seen as to be an academic subject, but it would also be seen as feeding into the spiritual, moral, social and cultural development of children, the SMSC of the school, and being a factor in the wider values system and ethos of the school. So I think, I think RE needs to be an academic subject. There are some students who we really want to go on to explore the philosophical and theological nature of thinking and thought, to become future academics and possibly future religious education teachers in schools. So there needs to be an academic route in schools, but there also needs to be an understanding that RE has a wider focus, which is around the development of character, of people's own value systems, of developing their own worldview, and of them becoming rounded citizens and feeding into a British values perspective. And I'm frustrated at the reason why this needs to be British values, but the designation that the government has given around British values, which is that actually all of us need to have respect and tolerance for people of other faiths. Well, how do we know who those people are and what they believe? By good teaching. So implicit in the idea that there are values within our schools, actually part of that is about understanding each other, and that means understanding religion and worldviews.
Thank you, Ed. So our last panellist is Dr. Joseph Downing from Aston University and Fellow of the LSE, writing on minority rights, migration and Islam in France. So Dr. Downing, just picking up those points about multiculturalism, looking at the judgment on this case, what does it tell you about the understanding of multiculturalism and how it is displayed or should be promoted in British society?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because it's easy to look at multiculturalism or multicultural policies as if they're one single set of policies that are somehow laid out a bit like a constitution, right, in one central place. But really what we have, especially in the British case, which does vary to France, that I'll explain a little bit more about in a second, is you have a gradual evolution of values, laws, anti-discrimination measures, forms of accommodation, understanding that emerge over time, right? And the other thing to remember is that there is no one really central authority that gets to decide what multicultural policies are or what multiculturalism as a sort of, way of doing things politically is. And this is something that we see, right? We see, especially the Conservative government making particular proclamations about how David Cameron was part of this trend of saying that multiculturalism has failed and it's somehow a problem. But even him as Prime Minister doesn't get to dictate what that actually means, right? Nor do the courts, as we see in this particular case, nor does the civil service. Rather, there's a range of different actors at a range of different levels of government that play a role in deciding politically what multiculturalism is in the UK, as is the case also in many other societies. So, this is a particularly worrying judgment in many ways, but it doesn't mean that what we're seeing here is a sort of massive sea change. And however much the right of the Conservative Party might want to see a radical reordering of how British society works. These courts are only one actor in a broad sort of range of actors that contribute to the traditions of how we govern our societies.
Why is it a worrying judgment?
Because it codifies the more general trend of the political rhetoric that seeks to kind of marginalize, especially Muslims and the Islamic religion in the United Kingdom. Now, there's an interesting parallel here across many European countries. I can speak about France more specifically because that's where I do most of my research. And we've seen this rhetoric really since actually the 1990s in France become increasingly powerful in French politics and society. And we've seen the application of Laïcité, which is the French version of secularism. Now, unlike the UK, France has a much more codified approach to a question of religion in society, right? It has 1901 separation of church and state that comes out of the French Revolution. And I'm not going to bore you with the details, but they have this particular document. Even within that, and it's actually much more flexible than it's often given credit for. Now, flexible in a good way, being, for example, it sets out the ability for you to have access to sort of resources for worship in state institutions if you can't leave those institutions to go and worship outside. So, for example, in the army, they have imams, they have chaplains, they have rabbis, because you can't, just leave the army and go off to a mosque, a synagogue, or a church. So it is more flexible than it's often given credit for, but that flexibility and that need for it to be constantly reinterpreted also has led to some quite problematic laws being passed in France. So we can see, the ban on the headscarf in the 1990s that made waves in schools. We can also see now there was a discussion around the banning of the abaya, so kind of loose fitting long Islamic clothes in schools. And in France, this has led to a range of different issues in really kind of making it difficult and making it, hard for young French Muslims to practice their faith in schools in any kind of way at all. And I think this in a society like France, a bit like the UK, has a massive young Muslim population, is from a policy perspective not necessarily a good one. I don't agree actually with Babur Singh's comment that we need to remove religion so that we can come together. This is one view of many views, in fact, about interreligious dialogue and interreligious tolerance. There are many others which say that actually it's by looking at our faiths and our worldviews we can see that we have many commonalities. So I don't think she has a monopoly on truth, as it were, around this subject either.
There was one comment afterwards that said the judgment or the approach by the school was a French-style secular state with religion pushed to the private arena. Do you think that the French model has any merit at all or application that could be applied to the situation of head teachers like Catherine Babur Singh in Michaela School in this country?
The interesting thing actually about French secularism is that it emerged without any consideration of Muslims or Islam whatsoever, really, right? The interesting thing about French secularism is that it really came about in the wake of the French Revolution and really to kind of try and put an end to things like wars between Catholics and Protestants or, anti-Semitism against Jews, for example, right? Which, we can see from the Dreyfus affair, it doesn't exactly have a great record on. But this isn't, we often see now Laïcité as being this thing that's about Islam against Islam, but that's not how it emerged, right? And I think I don't, every model has its pluses and minuses, right? So looking at France, for example, we see, for example, a good level of labour market integration amongst French Muslims, for example, right? You see a range of French Muslims taking active parts in French life, despite the fact that public displays of religion are prohibited in state institutions. But I think in the educational context, I definitely don't think that this is a positive step, right? I don't think that forcing individuals at quite delicate, rapidly changing and dynamic stages in their life where they may want to experiment with being more religious, with being less religious, with different ways of making sense of their world, forcing them to do it in a very prescribed, set way. I'm not hugely in agreement with this. I don't actually think this is good for individuals at that age. I also don't agree, it's worth saying, with many of the other rules at the Michaela School, as someone that went to a state school in the UK, that the thought of walking down the corridor in silence to me seems really dystopian and like something out of a bad science fiction movie. So I think there are a range of sort of bizarre draconian rules that she's put in place that she has not been, I think, fairly criticised for because her school has a fairly good academic record. I think there's a range of things in her educational philosophy that can be damaging to individuals in their teens, not just this question of expression of religion.
Thank you for your comments there. I'm going to broaden this out now to some of the comments that are coming in the chat box. Dr. Karamat Iqbal has been commenting. Would you like to put your question in person?
Michaela's school is just one way of looking at the world, and they just got lucky and they got support of the courts. But there are a whole range of responses to this issue across our nation in schools where there's a continuum of responses from the begrudgingly accommodating prayer to the very positively accommodating of prayer in schools. And I had 3 schools in my PhD research in Birmingham. These are state schools, which would be along that continuum. One school was extremely positive. It's run by a faith leader, a Christian teacher running a 100% Muslim school. And they have a very positive approach to, they have 500 students on a Friday sometimes praying, and the head teacher talks to them, and the head teacher also goes to the local mosques and shares his faith. And so there is such a range of activity going on across the country. And I've published that in my book first, and now we're about to bring out another book, again providing some great examples of positive responses. So I think we wait to see how insignificant the Michaela situation is. It's just one school, and the other schools will continue to be positive, thankfully.
Thank you. Can I bring in Catherine Pepinster as well? Catherine, you've been making several comments in the chat box there about all kinds of things, chaplaincies and prayer. Would you like to comment or ask a question of one of the panelists?
I found the judgment rather odd, and I was amazed at how newspapers across the political divide, from the Guardian to the Telegraph, seemed to support Michaela School, assuming that this is the way forward for more secular schools. And yet at the same time, we're told that things such as mindfulness or meditation are good for young people. And here is something that you would think would benefit children who particularly have an affiliation to a particular faith. I don't understand why people are so wary of the idea that children might pray. And it's also very peculiar because the Department for Education has put out advice previously suggesting that that schools should enable children's faiths to be respected and for them to follow them. And there are many schools that are managing to provide space and time for children to pray. And I think it's a strange kind of secularism that only works if you deny part of somebody's identity.
Yeah, I was going to add, I think there is a very unhealthy conversation, I think, taking place at the level of government about the nature of Britain and identity. And I think one of the interesting contradictions is very often Bible saying in the school has been celebrated by parts of the political establishment who themselves are arguing for a more vocal and maybe even muscular kind of British identity, which includes Christianity. And then in other spaces, various reasons are deployed, often on the basis of a claim towards secularism, a secularism that doesn't reflect the way in which Britain has handled religion historically. And I kind of mean to say this in the sense that there is, I think, a lot of incoherence going on in terms of those arguments. Often secularism is deployed as mainly a way of managing and limiting Muslims. And I think there is a conversation going on more broadly about British identity, which has less to do with Muslims and more to do with what Britain means today. And often the Muslim communities are caught up in the middle. So I just wanted to add that to Catherine's comments there. Thank you.
To me, I completely agree with that. This, to me, seems a very alien way of handling religion as we have done historically in Britain, right? Like, we don't have that same tradition that France has of, you know, being sort of aggressively anti-religion and pushing religion out of the public realm. And yeah, this also sits quite uneasily with me. And I agree with what Abdulazim has also said, which is this question that often, and this is what has happened in France, right? Is that secularism and debates around secularism and also legislation that's produced around secularism is used really to target one community and one community only, the community that we're discussing here, right? Which is the Muslim one, which is extremely problematic and I think quite counterproductive, to be honest.
Thank you. Bringing in a comment from Tim Wyatt in the chat box.
It strikes me that a really interesting key factor is that in many other religious traditions, particularly Christianity, prayer can take place in a wide variety of ways, including kind of silently inside your own head while you're doing something else, or even if a group of Christian students did want to pray as a group together, they could. There's no reason why they couldn't just find a quiet classroom during the lunch break, and they aren't drawn by, as we heard from Abdul earlier, like the need that some Muslims feel that they have to pray in a more regimented way, which is much more difficult to kind of squeeze into a school's timetable. And so that, I suspect, that is why this case has kind of flared up around Islam in particular, as well as acknowledging there's a distinct kind of public conversation around Islam, but also that actually, like, Christian prayer, for example, doesn't rub up against a school's timetable in the same way. Not that that's not impossible to surmount, of course it isn't, but yeah, just an observation.
I think that's a very good point. And I think it also highlights the difficulty of judges trying to work out and getting into questions about what Islam requires. Because as we've heard, there isn't that unified voice in Islam in the same way there is for some Christian traditions. So another problematic part of the judgment was that there was reason in it where the judge suggested that the fact that prayer could take place later meant that there was no interference. And for me, that is a very, very concerning aspect of the judgment, because that's, you know, the court really getting in to theological questions and trying really to almost sort of colonize the theological in legal terms, if I can put it like that. And the other point I think is worth making is that for all the rhetoric in this case and about this case about secularity, we haven't got a secular system in England and Wales. Far from it. The starting point is still Christian, even in schools without a religious character. You know, the requirements about religious education reflecting the fact that the traditions, religious traditions are in the main Christian. The daily collective worship, which is there as a matter of law, if not necessarily as a matter of practice, which should be wholly or mainly of a broadly Christian character. The starting point here is not secular. And I think this case also poses issues in terms of if it's applied in relation to in the context of a faith school. You know, if you follow the logic of the argument here and don't assume that it just is there because it applies to Islam, and that's an assumption, if you follow the logic of the letter of the law here, then, you know, a pupil who's in a faith school, simply because that's the only school in the area, but isn't particularly religious, wouldn't be able to run an Article 9 argument to get out of that particular practice either. So it's deeply problematic and probably quite religiously illiterate.
I just made the point in the chat that actually we have a strange situation here where the judgment seems to have been saying that this girl needs to go to another school if she doesn't agree with the rules. But actually, that's the law actually already allows opt-outs in schools for children to opt out of religious education lessons and collective worship if it runs against their conscience. And so there are already rules in place for schools to be able to designate different rules about children with different belief systems and worldviews. Therefore, to tell this child they need to join another school seems nonsensical.
Bruce Thompson, you've put a comment in the chat box. Do you want to make your point in person?
I just want to sort of come in and recognise all that's being said, but also to recognise that there are people in this country who are secular and they do want to be free from religion. And therefore, if there is a secular school available to them, then they have a right too, just as much right as those of us who have a religion to express. They also have a right to express their view, their belief. And if they wish to send their children to a secular school, presumably their rights are being infringed upon if that school then is forced to provide and to sort of create religious accessibility and so on for others. So I think we ought to take into account the rights of people who are secular, and I speak as a religious person, as you can see myself, and I think, you know, as I pointed out, the school is not exactly underattended and underapplied for, and we aren't living in that particular environment. And there are good reasons, as I understand it, from what I've seen of Michaela through TV and other contacts, why parents in that particular area, the place is oversubscribed, why they particularly choose that school than any other in that environment. And I think those are the things that we also need to take into account. I hear what everything's being said, but I think we need to hear why it is that parents are particularly choosing Michaela as a secular school.
I wouldn't agree that it's a defendable right that secular communities, individuals can say that a person who decides to pray in a space near them, in the same institution as them, in the same school as them, that infringes upon their right. I think if there is, for example, a secular school and that ethos is placed within the environment, that's certainly understandable. But this comes down into an individual wishing to have their religious rights met in a schooling context. And so, to give a kind of similar example, it might be, you have faith schools, Muslim schools, Christian schools. In a Christian faith school, a Muslim still has the right to pray. In a Muslim faith school, a Christian still has a right to pray. So it's not that, it would be a very strange right to say that a secular school can say, in the school, you have no right to pray. You have to be secular like us in practice. And I think that's where the legal aspect comes in. But I'd also say that there is a broader kind of, I think, question about bounded choices. And I agree with my colleague again, Professor Sandberg, about the idea that, you voluntarily come into X space or X institution, and therefore you then forfeit all your rights. And there are bounded choices. I don't know what the reasons are. A person might send a school to Michaela over another, but we have to think about contexts like transport and affordability, locality. There are bounded choices involved. And fundamentally, the parents of these children are paying the taxes which are funding the school. And I don't want to sound like Taxpayers Alliance and taking that kind of really reductive argument, but I think that's part of the contract we're in. We're part of a state, we're part of this the nation. We all have a say in how things are done collectively, and to kind of mark it out as activist, or to mark it out as a voluntary acceptance that certain rights are going to be taken away from you, I don't think I agree with.
Thank you. Can I bring in Deepak Naik in the final minutes of the briefing? 2 points, really. One is that schools are a community. And so to imagine that, an action of one person has no bearings on the atmosphere, the environment within that community,
is questionable in my mind. So that was one thing, that we are dependent on one another in society, at a workplace, in schools, etc. The second one is, and if I get this wrong, Ed, please forgive me, but values, I think possibly we need to do more work around values, but there should be and must be, a set of values that we could all own, so that we actually have some kind of basis to work from and live within. Otherwise, how do we operate and relate with one another and live with one another if we don't have any kind of framework, foundation, which I think values are in a society?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree about values. And I despair at some schools that don't, or historically have not really grasped that idea. I think the idea that your direction needs to be led by a vision underpinned by clear values which identify the way that we live together. I think that's absolutely true, and I lament the fact that I see this actually quite good practice in many schools with religious character, and often in more what has been called secular schools. I mean, schools without religious character, I often see they have a lack of real direction of that sense of what binds us together and holds us more than just the academic achievement of pupils. So absolutely agree. We need values in our schools, and those need to be worked on collectively, not imposed.
Thank you. Professor Sundberg, I'm going to ask you to sum the whole thing up as we're approaching the end of the briefing. In summary, what impact will the Michaela School judgment have on the education system, of the implications for other schools? Do you think that other schools would be required, therefore, to reconsider offering prayer rooms, or do you feel that there will be no long-term side effect of this judgment?
I think that's a very good question, but difficult question, because obviously, again, sort of my clairvoyance skills are not up to it. But I think the risk of this judgment, as I said earlier, is both symbolic and legal. And I think symbolically, this judgment could be seen as justifying this particular route, this particular approach, and entrenching this idea of secularism as being the way forward. The judgment doesn't do that, but nevertheless, it can be simplified in those terms. As I said before, the key thing to remember with this judgment is all it's saying is that what the school did, the school's particular ban, in the particular circumstance, was not unlawful. That doesn't mean that it's good practice. And I think what we do need to watch out is how the judgment is summarized in terms of guidance, in terms of policies, and that it's not presented as being good practice. And as I mentioned earlier, legally, I think it's likely to prevent claims from succeeding and indeed stop claims coming to court. And that also is deeply, deeply problematic.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists and everyone else who asked questions and engaged with us today, and look forward to seeing you at the next briefing.